the word for it except miraculous in that sense. Acts chapter 2. That's where we're going to be this morning. Because not only is it the Sunday of Memorial Day weekend, it's Pentecost. Happy Pentecost. I bet you've never heard anybody say that to you before. Well, there's a reason for that, I think, because preaching a sermon about Pentecost can be a bit of a tricky thing for a preacher. And I can think of at least two reasons why that's true. In our modern church world, the word Pentecost is often linked to those believers who are very emotional and get very excited in their form of worship. For those of you who are here with us this morning who aren't normally a part of our local church body, you know that ain't us. We are Methodists because there's a method to how we do things. It's all planned out, and if it's not planned out, we're probably not going to do it. Those folks who are called Pentecostals are those folks who practice speaking in tongues, an event that occurs in Acts chapter 2, sort of, and which to them is a sign of the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit. So when a preacher gets up and starts preaching about Pentecost, the congregation sometimes might think that, oh, he's trying to get us to start this Pentecostal style of worship. No. The second thing that can make preaching about Pentecost tricky is the fact that Pentecost is an ancient Jewish spiritual festival. It's one of those Old Testament festivals that God made so that the people of Israel would have this event that pointed them towards something that God was going to be doing in the future. So, the thing about that, though, for us is that we're not ancient Jews. We weren't raised with all of this information, with all of this training about what do these things mean. And so for us to take our modern mindset and our Western mentality and try to force ourselves into the understanding of what it meant to be pre-Jesus Jewish, we can't do that. Our minds don't work that way because that's not who we are. That's not how we were raised. Now, there are facts that we can know about this festival of Pentecost. For example, it was done to remember the giving of the law by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. It signified the end of the harvest time, which had begun 50 days before at the festival of Passover. It was also known as the Feast of Weeks, and please don't ask me why, because I've yet to find out why that's the fact. And it was also one of 3 pilgrimage festivals. There were 3 times during the year that it was a requirement for Jewish males to come to the temple, and this is one of those 3 pilgrimage festivals. Those are the facts that we can know, but just knowing the facts doesn't make us understand what made the festival of Pentecost important to God. It dawned on me last night as I was working on this that if we want to understand Pentecost, what we first have to do is start with Passover, because these 2 festivals are linked together. These are the 2 main spring festivals for the ancient Israelites. Passover commemorated the escape from Egypt. You remember Passover way back in the book of Exodus. You find that there was a sacrifice that was made. The blood of the sheep that was sacrificed, the blood of the lamb that was sacrificed, was put on the doorposts and on the lintels of the houses of those who were followers of God, who were Hebrew people. And if they did that, then the death angel passed over their house, and the firstborn of their house didn't die in that final plague that God had poured out upon the Egyptians. That's where Passover comes from. Passover not only commemorated the escape from Egypt, but later it would also incorporate the beginning of the grain harvest into the festival. Passover was a festival of beginnings. It was the beginning of the Hebrew nation. It was the beginning of the grain harvest. It was the beginning of the spring season, if you will. On the other hand, Pentecost seems to be a festival of endings. Pentecost reminded the people of the giving of the law of Moses, which was the first step in the end of the separation between God and humanity. Later, Pentecost was the end of the grain harvest. It was a time to give thanks for God's provision. And just as Memorial Day weekend for us kind of brings about the end of spring and the beginning of summer, so too for the ancient Israelites, you had the end of the grain harvest. That was the end of the growing season, because following that harvest then went into the long, hot, dry summer as part of that part of the world. When God chose the festival of Pentecost to pour out His Spirit on Jesus' followers in order to make the church, to interrupt His time scale, His time frame with this thing, this mystery called the church, God was showing that the end was there for the incomplete way of trying to know God through these acts of the law. The complete way had been provided through Christ Jesus, by faith in Jesus. And we can now be made spiritually whole with God in that relationship, that faith relationship with Him through Jesus Christ. With this in mind, let's take a look at a couple of verses from Acts chapter 2. These verses are right in the middle of Peter's sermon that we read just a little bit ago, and they follow the outpouring of God's Spirit on the day of Pentecost. So here we go, Acts chapter 2, verse 22. Paul says these words, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know. Him, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified and put to death, whom God raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be held by death." There are some things in here that I want to pick out, that I want us to look at, some phrases in these verses. The first is this, men of Israel. When Peter uses this phrase, men of Israel, we know from that phrase that he is talking to those folks who are followers of the law of Moses. These are the ones who understand from the time that they were little, they've been taught, they've been instructed in what the law of Moses is. They know what Pentecost is. They know that, yes, there's this harvest, but it's not just a time to be out in the field taking in our last harvest. It's also a time to be in the temple, to be thanking God for His provision. It's also an opportunity for us to join with other believers, other followers of the law, and to be reminded that we are part of a community that goes so far beyond just us. The second phrase, Jesus of Nazareth. This was a name that many had heard of. Even those who weren't followers of Jesus, there were folks in this crowd who had heard of Jesus of Nazareth. They were well aware that just a month and a half before, at Passover, they were aware of what had occurred, of the events that surrounded that. In fact, one of the gospel writers says, I believe it's Luke, says that after the resurrection, Jesus appears to the two on the way to Emmaus. And one of them asks Jesus, who they don't recognize yet, but they ask Jesus, "Have you not heard? How could you have not heard? All of Jerusalem is in an uproar over what has happened." So it's obvious that they knew who Jesus of Nazareth was. Attested by God is another way of saying that the works and the teaching of Jesus that had been shown, or that had been done, were shown by God to be in line with everything that God had revealed about Himself through the law of Moses, the writings of the prophets in the Old Testament. There was nothing that Jesus taught or did that was out of line in any way with what God had already revealed about Himself. Jesus said very clearly, "I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law," to make it complete, to bring it to its full. That's what He did. The next phrase, the determined purpose and foreknowledge. We're Methodists, we're Wesleyans. We shy away from words like determined purpose and foreknowledge because they're scary to us. But when we understand what these words mean, it simply means that God was not caught off guard by Jesus' death. God had had a plan from the beginning, from even before time began, before sin even entered into heaven. God had had a plan to deal with sin, if it occurred, and to remove it from his creation once and forever. You see, as much as the Jewish leaders might want to take the credit for having Jesus killed, they couldn't. And Peter reminds them of that. He says this was all part of what God had had in mind from the beginning, that there would be a way that he would find in order to bring about a restoration of his creation and of his people from the power of sin and death. Hands of lawless men is that next phrase that's there. And I pull that not from the version that I've been reading out of here, but I pull it out of the Revised Standard Version. I like the way that they have that phrase there, the hands of lawless men. The Jewish leaders had no power to condemn a person to death. They didn't. They didn't have that civil authority to do that because they were essentially put in place. They were puppet leaders under the hand of the Roman Empire. It was the Romans who could condemn someone to death. And so the Jewish leaders coerced the Romans into crucifying Jesus. It's the Romans who are being described here as men without the law. The Jewish leaders had the law of God. So really what Peter is doing here by using this phrase is bringing about a moral condemnation upon the heads of these Jewish leaders who had Jesus crucified. You had the law. You should have known better. But you didn't. You refused to hear what the law said about who God was and what he was doing through Jesus. One of my favorite little clauses, little phrases in here is this one: having loosed the pains of death. Loosed is one of those Greek words that means to be set free from. It means to do away with. It means to put aside forever, having loosed the pains of death. Before Jesus' resurrection, death was a force to be feared because there was a separation from God and from loved ones that death brought. The grave was a scary thing to talk about. But now, death and the grave don't have to be feared. The power of death to separate humanity from God has been defeated by Jesus' resurrection. We still suffer death in our physical bodies. We're all well aware of that. We are still waiting for God to set all things right once and forever. But God has given the power in Jesus to be set free from spiritual death and to be restored to him in a right relationship. At the core of these verses, we see that God is telling us through Peter that the real power that Pentecost day is not with the law of Moses. That law pointed to a time when the law would be no more, when it would be completed or fulfilled by God's Messiah. Nor does the power of Pentecost lie with the Jewish leaders. They didn't have the power to put Jesus to death. They weren't a force to be reckoned with. Nor does the power of Pentecost lie with the Roman authorities. In spite of their vast political and military might, the Roman Empire would not be an eternal empire, would not be an eternal kingdom like God's kingdom. The power that was being demonstrated at this first Pentecost was the power of God to bring his redemption into the world at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. For us today, the power of Pentecost is not the power to demonstrate to others how spiritually gifted we are through our outward demonstrations of our actions. Instead, Pentecost reminds us of the power of God that has been provided to set us free from the power of sin, from the guilt and the stain of sins that we have committed, of the power of God to cleanse us from the desire and the need for continued sinning, and ultimately the power of God to set us free from the necessity of being separated from him from all of eternity. What God has provided in Jesus is the opportunity for all who will believe to start a relationship with God through faith in Jesus. And this relationship is the end of being separated from God. And as we continue in this faith relationship, God will be at work in us to shape our will and our attitude into the moral will and the attitude of Jesus, so that we will be able to please God in all that we do and say. That's the power of Pentecost and the freedom and renewal that God offers is the promise of Pentecost that he has fulfilled. Sean, let's sing our final hymn. As we get ready to sing our last hymn,